Okay, so today we're going to take a look at the esophagus and the stomach. So, the esophagus is basically just a tube that runs from the mouth down to the stomach, as you can see right here. It is only about 10 inches long, all right, so not too long. It does go down behind your trachea, your breathing tubes, and remember there's a flap, the epiglottis, that prevents food from going down into the breathing tubes, so it shunts food down into the esophagus. So basically the function of the esophagus is simply just to move food from the mouth to the stomach. There's not really any digestion that goes on in the esophagus. It's simply just moving food through. And the process for moving that food is called, as you can see here, peristalsis. All right, and peristalsis is simply muscle contractions along the esophagus that squeeze and contract and move the food. And you can see that right here. All right, the picture up here in the corner, this is peristalsis. And you can see it's just sort of contracting and it squeezes the food through the esophagus. It's really all it is. So that process is called peristalsis. And really that only takes about 4 to 8 seconds to move from the mouth down to the stomach, so it's not long. There is mucus secreted by the esophagus. It coats the esophagus and helps it not to scrape. So that's why, you get coffee and things like that when that mucus builds up. But there can be mucus in the esophagus to help coat it and help move through the food. Also, I'll just talk a little bit here about this. The stomach acid, which we'll learn about in a little bit, is hydrochloric acid, and sometimes that can get up into the esophagus. So you have basically, there are little, they're called sphincters, they're little muscles at the end of the esophagus that allow food from the esophagus into the stomach, and that should be blocked off basically. So there should be something here that sort of blocks it off. But occasionally that stomach acid will get up into the esophagus, and that's what causes heartburn. So they call it heartburn because it feels like it's in your heart because the esophagus goes, down behind there. It's in the chest, but really it's just acid from your stomach getting up in there. All right, so really that's all there is to the esophagus. Like I said, there's not a whole lot. So we are going to move on to the stomach. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about the stomach. So obviously your stomach is this, they call it a J-shaped organ where obviously more digestion takes place. So here's your stomach. It's this red one. There are parts to the stomach. There's different curvatures and things. So you can see here it's not just like, it has different shapes to it, I guess. They call it a J-shaped bag. That helps to break down food further. So there's 2 types of digestion that we've talked about, mechanical and chemical digestion. So I want to talk a little bit about both of these types here that occur in the stomach. So I'm actually going to start with mechanical digestion. So mechanical digestion, again, is when food is simply just broken down into smaller pieces, taking a cracker and crumbling it. That's mechanical digestion. It makes it easier to digest when it's in smaller pieces. So some of what goes on in the stomach is just simply mechanical digestion. So there's this acid in the stomach, and that acid is hydrochloric acid. So it's a pretty strong acid, and that will help to kill bacteria and things that get in there in the food that you eat or in through the passages, like through your mouth. So it does help that way. But that acid also helps to break things down mechanically. You also have muscles. I don't know if you can see that in here, but there are muscles that line the stomach, and that stomach will churn and break up those pieces. That's part of mechanical digestion also. During that mechanical digestion, if that happens, if that stomach is trying to churn when it's empty, that's what causes the growling that we hear in our stomach. So, we know we're hungry when our stomach starts to growl. And basically what's happening is it's churning and it's empty and there's nothing in there. So it's saying, okay, it needs some food, right? So that's why you get that hungry sensation. So that's mechanical digestion. There's also chemical digestion that occurs, and chemical digestion is when we have bigger molecules that are broken down into their smaller components. So proteins get broken down into amino acids. Lipids get broken down into fatty acids. That's chemical digestion. Carbohydrates are broken down into monosaccharides. All right, so they are also smaller pieces, but it's actually a chemical change that's occurring. Bonds are being broken. So we also have enzymes that are released into the stomach and by the stomach that help break things down. So proteins are broken down by an enzyme called pepsin that's released in the stomach. And lipids, let's see if I can write it right here. Actually, I'm going to write it down here, are broken down by an enzyme called lipase. And so those are two enzymes that help break down proteins and lipids in the stomach. That's part of chemical digestion. All right, so we have these food being churned up, getting smaller and smaller, and then eventually they're going to go down into the intestines and the small intestine, and that's where this is going to continue a lot of chemical digestion, and where those fatty acids and those amino acids will then be absorbed into the bloodstream to go to other parts of the body to be reused. So just a couple of other things here about the stomach. So there is also mucus in the stomach, just like there is in the esophagus. And the mucus here, again, coats the lining of the stomach, and it helps protect the stomach from the acid that's in there. So it's a very acidic environment, and that acid can wear away at that lining, and so that mucus protects it. And so if you've ever heard of anybody having a stomach ulcer, what happens is that mucus lining gets worn away by that acid, and that can be painful, all right, to them. So that mucus is there to protect us from that acid and help sort of move the food through also. By the way, food in the stomach is called chyme at this point. In the mouth, it was called a bolus. Now it's called chyme. The stomach can hold about 1 gallon of food at a time. So think about a gallon jug. That's about how much your stomach can hold, and that can change depending on different scenarios. But again, we have these sphincters that basically, prevent too much food from getting in there, and then once it's digested, to move it down into the small intestine. And food spends, so we said it was only seconds in the esophagus. It spends up to about 5 hours in the stomach. All right, digesting and breaking it down further and getting it ready for the small intestine. All right, so I think that's the information I need to give you about the stomach, and then we'll do the small intestine at another time.